Hi. I'm so happy for the opportunity to speak with you in the light. I'm going to start with reading a few lines from a poem by the Polish poet and Nobel laureate Wisława Szymborska called The End and the Beginning. Those who knew what was going on here must give way to those who know little and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. I'm starting with those lines because they speak so well to the overconfident certainty with which we approach the multiple crises that our world faces. Climate emergency, social inequality, war, land grabbing, a global pandemic, the list goes on. And we approach these crises with such certainty when instead we should approach them with a sense of curiosity and openness. I also wanted to start with the lines from a poem because we are at a festival called Concrete Love. I'm a Nigerian, Finnish, and Swedish writer and social critic based in London. And for many years, I have been writing and speaking and advocating around the world about feminist transformation and African liberation. And there is one word that repeatedly comes up in the spaces that I occupy, and that word is system. In attempting to educate and transform the crises that we face, thinkers and scholars and activists frequently say that there is a root cause to all of these problems, and that is the system. They say that the system is corrupt, violent, it is oppressive. But what is it that we actually mean with the word system? What is this system that is so flawed that we can blame it for all of our social ills? What people mean when they speak about the system is usually our institutions, so our legal system or our educational systems, our political systems, and the power structures that inform those systems, so things like patriarchy or white supremacy or elitism. In the corporate world, when people speak about the system, they are referring to the structures such as neoliberalism or surveillance capitalism, the rat race, basically. But I would like to define system a little bit differently, more deeply. I think that the system with a capital S is knowledge, our intellect, what we know and why we know it. I think that the failure to perceive the big system as knowledge, as our ways of thinking and seeing and understanding the world and ourselves, means that whenever we do get the opportunity to reinvent and reimagine our institutions, we simply end up replicating and even increasing the same crises over and over again. For example, when it comes to technology, the internet and social media held so much promise for the world. There was going to be so much social change off the back end of these new technologies. And instead, they have ended up replicating and increasing so many of the issues that our world faces. And we now stand at the threshold of incredibly huge technological shifts that are going to have ramifications on all of our lives. We're already integrated with artificial intelligence. There's the colonization of space. There's technologies like IVG, which stands for in vitro gametogenesis, which basically is a technology with which we'll be able to grow babies outside of a female womb. And the question is, are these new technologies again going to replicate and increase social crises? These are some of the leading concerns that led me to write my book, Sensuous Knowledge, which proposes a different way of knowing. In my book, I coined the notion Europatriarchical knowledge to describe a Eurocentric and male-dominated way of thinking about ourselves and the cosmos that has indeed become the convention and the system because it is systemic in its approach to power and resources and time. I call it Europatriarchal knowledge because throughout history, a small group of people, typically men and typically people of white European descent, have shaped the ideas that impact all of our collective lives. Men like Marx, Hobbes, Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, Kant, etc. And many of these men were very wise. My point is that it is a small group of people that have shaped a very diverse world. So what lies at the center of Europatriarchal knowledge is this epistemic certainty, rigid quantification, and an obsession with assessment. It is a way of knowing that values science, but devalues the physical world. So it undervalues matter, earth, embodiment. It sees nature and the bodies of women and indigenous people as resources to endlessly exploit. But nevertheless, Europatriarchal knowledge is not synonymous with whiteness, or with maleness, for that matter. And nor is it an approach that is entirely negative. So while Europatriarchal structures, which have been informed by Europatriarchal knowledge, are entirely negative because they have biases and blind spots built into them, Europatriarchal knowledge, the narrative itself, is not always negative. It is thanks to Europatriarchal knowledge that we had the scientific, the industrial, and the information revolutions, for example. And without those revolutions, we wouldn't have had the Enlightenment. And without the Enlightenment, there would be no modern universities, no encyclopedias, no maps or trains or planes. So things that enhance all of our collective lives. The problem is that Europatriarchal knowledge is an approach to knowing that cannot take us to a higher dimension in which we can experience some kind of harmony, not perfect harmony, but what it means to thrive and to be human. For that kind of higher dimension, we need something else. We need something that is more generative, more explorative. We need a way of knowing that engages the poetic, the body, ritual, earth, the rapturous. And I call this something else sensuous knowledge. I conceived of sensuous knowledge during a trip to the Singularity University at the NASA research camp in Silicon Valley. I was there to give a lecture on African feminism, and it was a really memorable event. It was both incredibly uplifting and incredibly concerning. It was uplifting because I found myself among my tribe of sorts. So I was with people for a week who are into big ideas that are going to shape the world, as I am too. And the conversations were really stimulating. It was concerning because some of the conversations that happened outside of the talks and the events really hit home for me how our way of knowing was not going to manifest in all of these big ideas that were being shared. I recall one conversation, for example, during dinner. So I was having dinner with a group of people who were all men and all white and all very privileged. And during dinner, it transpired that this group of people were certain that they were going to live well into their hundreds. So unless something completely unexpected happened, they were going to live until they were 150 or maybe even 200. Now, longevity, that's technology which can make humans live much longer than we do today, is more commonly discussed now. But 5 or 6 years ago, when this conversation happened, I found it really jarring. I come from a part of the world, the African continent, where life expectancy, due to geopolitical history, is still well below the hundreds in many regions of the continent. Speaking of history, only 0.5% of recorded human history over the last 3,500 years is women's history. That's 0.5% only. So when it comes to knowledge, it is definitely men who have shaped our shared human pool of knowledge. And so I wrote my book with the insight that you cannot create feminist transformation using patriarchal logic. And in Sensuous Knowledge, I wrote instead about universal concepts that shape all our lives, things like power and beauty and identity and womanhood, with a feminist sensibility, an Africa-centered, and an African philosophical sensibility. Patriarchal logic wants to separate and divide and create rigid and robotic rules. And so instead, I wanted to marry together different realms of life, of lived experience, of knowledge. So this simultaneously lyrical and logical approach to knowledge production is, for me, in great part inspired by Yoruba philosophy. And Yoruba is the heritage that I belong to. It is an ethnic group in modern-day Nigeria and beyond. In Yoruba, there is a concept called ogbon, and ogbon basically means knowledge, but more literally translated, it is phronesis, so the ancient Greek word for practical wisdom. And the creation myth goes that when the gods created the earth, they gave the people ogbon so that they could create societies that were elevated and in which people would thrive. But the gods knew that in order for ogbon to make a relevant impact, they needed to split it into two. And so they created ogbon inu and ogbon ori, which means knowledge of the gut and knowledge of the head, or you could translate it to say reason versus emotional intelligence. And to have only one type of knowledge, according to the Yoruba epos, was to be only partly wise. And so sensuous knowledge is rooted in this worldview. The argument is that we see, or it's calling for us to see our social crises both with reason and with emotional intelligence. I should add that by sensuous, I don't mean sensual. So where sensuality is tied to bodily pleasures, to our gustatory and auditory and tactile, to our instincts, basically, sensuousness means something that impacts us entirely. So when something impacts you, mind, body, and soul, then it is said to be sensuous. Books are sensuous, for example. You can touch them, you can smell them, you can taste the words on your tongue if you read them out loud. Books are also of different textures. They can be hand-stitched or hardback or aged. And books are therapeutic. They potentially transform the way that you live, the way that you look at the world. They affect you sensuously, entirely. But that said, even though sensuousness and sensuality are not the same thing, I'm not denying the sensual element in knowledge production. In fact, you could say that I'm calling for a kind of erotization of knowledge. So the erotic coming from the word eros, which means love. And so if we applied sensuous knowledge to something like the economy, we would create a kind of erotic economy in which there was intimacy and reciprocity and connection and meaning and creativity, and not only surplus and growth, which eventually leads to scarcity and a sense of lack. You could say that sensuous knowledge is a pragmatic utopia, in a way that I think the phrase concrete love is also a pragmatic utopian vision. So it's something that is, in some sense, dreamy and transcendental, but also actually practicable and doable. Utopias are desires for systemic change. And so going back to where we started, for when we see systems being about knowledge, it's easier to see that it is the way that we know things that produces our cultural, political, social, and even our spiritual experience. So I'm going to end with a small sensuous knowledge exercise. It's nothing elaborate, it's just a bit of a thought experiment. So I would like you to think about what you had for breakfast this morning. Maybe you had a slice of bread like I did. And if you were to describe your breakfast with Europatriarchical knowledge, so if you had a slice of bread and you were to describe it, you might give the nutritional content of this slice of bread. You might tell us exactly how many grams of carbohydrates it had. Probably too many, as tends to be the case when we're on travels or at events like this, at least for me. You might give the calorific count as well. Now, if instead you were to tell us about your breakfast with sensuous knowledge, you would still share the nutritional content, but you might also share the texture of the bread. What did it taste like? What color did it have? And what kind of sounds did you hear around you as you had your breakfast? Did you hear people speaking around you? Did you hear cars driving or birds singing or rain falling? And who made the bread? What tradition does it belong to? Now, the point is hardly that describing our breakfast in lyrical ways is going to change the world. But if we can apply sensuous knowledge, if we can apply this kind of awareness and presence to something as mundane and quotidian as breakfast and what we had for breakfast, then we can begin to see more easily how we can apply that to bigger things, to eventually the social crises that we face. So I'm going to read or reread the stanza from Szymborska's poem to end, but I'm also going to add the last lines of that poem because they really speak so well to this awareness, ultimately, that creates mind shifts, and mind shifts that create change. Those who knew what was going on here must give way to those who know little, and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. Thank you.